The main conclusion is, well, I guess I've reached two major conclusions. The first major conclusion is neither side won the conflict. I don't like to call it a war because it didn't really have too many it had some characteristics of a war, but it also had some characteristics of a massacre. So I'll call it the hostilities. Neither side came out the victor in the hostilities. And the second major conclusion I would reach from what happened is that the Palestinians, in this case Hamas, but the people in Gaza in general, have to radically rethink a strategy which, even though it has successfully stopped the Israeli killing machine, that's correct, it has successfully halted the Israeli killing machine, it has not successfully achieved any positive gains for the people of Gaza. In effect, we're right back to the same old ceasefire, which has a clause about lifting the siege, but the clause will never be put into effect.
But on the other side, Israelis went with a declared goal of obliterating Hamas, of obliterating the tunnels, of preventing Hamas from waging any attacks by missiles or projectiles against Israel, and they failed on all these fronts.
That's absolutely correct.
And in the Middle East history, whenever a guerrilla force manages to make Israel, to bring it to a stalemate or to cul-de-sac, then they consider themselves winners, because here there are no matching forces. The issue is if they can sustain and stay put facing all that, then they consider themselves winners.
Well, look, there's a big difference between whether they consider themselves winners and whether they actually are winners. And we have to look objectively at the situation. What we have now is a return to the status quo ante. The agreement that was reached, the ceasefire agreement, we don't know the exact terms, but they're pretty clear. The terms of the ceasefire agreement basically return us to what the agreement that was signed after Operation Pillar of Defense.
Never respected the agreement of ceasefire.
Yeah, but that's the whole point. There's no evidence that this new agreement is going to be respected. All the evidence points to the fact that it's simply going to be a return to the status quo ante, that is, the situation before Operation Protective Edge. Now, it is true that Israel did not win. I have no doubt about that. But
and they know if they come back, there will be a very
but the status quo, the status quo ante is tolerable for Israel. Israel can live with a Hamas controlling Gaza. The status quo ante is not tolerable for the people of Gaza because it means the siege has not yet been lifted. And so even though Israel's killing machine was stopped dead in its tracks, which, as I said, in my opinion is a correct evaluation, it doesn't mean that the people of Gaza have achieved any positive gains. They have the negative gain of stopping Israel. But as you recall, the whole purpose of the Hamas resistance, which it announced immediately as the hostilities broke out, their purpose was to lift the siege. There is no evidence.
But it is not Hamas who waged this war.
I know
on the receiving end.
I'm quite aware of that. I do not believe that Hamas instigated the conflict. There's no evidence of that. But to come out at the end where you started, after having said the goal was a ceasefire plus lifting the siege, that's not a victory. It's true that it was at the popularity level. It was a victory for Hamas. It's true that the stock of the Palestinian Authority plummeted. We don't have any dispute about that.
And the Israeli coalition.
Yes, and it's also true that there was a lot of disappointment, and more than disappointment, in Israel as the result of the latest hostilities. But the problem is you get so caught up in what I would consider tangential side issues or secondary issues that you forget that there is an overarching political goal. What do you want to achieve? As I understand it, and you can correct me, the people in Gaza have a short-term goal. They want the siege to end. The siege that's been going on for 7 years since Hamas came to control Gaza in late 2007. They want that siege to end. That's their middle or short-term goal. Their long-term goal is, along with the people in the West Bank, to end the occupation by Israel. So, since that's their overarching goals, you have to ask the question, not whether Hamas's popularity surged or the Palestinian Authority's popularity plummeted, not whether the Israelis are happy or unhappy with the outcome. You have to ask the basic question, what was accomplished in terms of the goals?
Well, we can hear that Hanan Ashrawi, when she came to the United Nations a few days ago, she was more emboldened. She wanted a timeline for the independence. She wanted that from the Obama administration, from the United Nations. They are in the process of putting forward a strong argument for independence and resolving final issues.
You're much too serious an individual to take this sort of nonsense seriously.
No, I'm not taking it
the United Nations on its own, the United Nations on its own is not going to do anything.
Of course, it's not.
But
the Palestinians now have higher voice.
They have.
With what happened in Gaza.
They do not have a higher voice. I'm writing now a little book, not just on what happened in Gaza in the past, during those 51 days, but the whole period beginning with 2006, the victory of Hamas in the parliamentary elections, and then Cast-led, then the Mavi Marmara, then Operation Pillar of Defense, and now Operation Protective Edge. I look at all four, and you know what's the most striking? And I have to admit, I was surprised when I reread what I wrote in those years. After each one of those events, the Palestinian profile was higher. Have you forgotten that after Israel attacked the Mavi Marmara, there was the big outcry when all the world leaders were saying that the blockade of Gaza was unsustainable, that the blockade had to be lifted? Have you forgotten the Security Council passed Resolution 1860 saying it had to be lifted? And then it has a high profile, and then it disappears.
But what is the difference in this time? What happened in Gaza recently, for the first time, we've seen the Palestinians with the Israelis face to face, and as you said yourself in your recent writings, that the casualties among the Israelis on soldier level was very high. The Palestinians were not targeting civilians, as the West or Western media saying that these tunnels were meant to go and capture civilians and slaughter civilians, to go to schools, to go nurseries. This has not happened. No, there was a fair confrontation, an honorable one, and they have achieved a lot, 4 times, 5 times more than in the previous
I perfectly well recognize that more Israeli combatants were killed this time than in the past, that on a strictly military level, which is not my cup of tea, I'm not a military analyst, I don't care for death as just a matter of principle. It doesn't appeal to me, so I'm not interested so much in wars. But I recognize, yes, it's true that this time, many times more Israeli combatants were killed. But one but one has to be realistic about these things. You have to go back and look at history. Israel has withdrawn twice from territories it occupied. It withdrew from the Egyptian Sinai with the beginning with the Camp David framework agreement in 1977, and then the actual 1978, and then the actual agreement 1979. But that only came after the 1973 war, when Israel lost between, we don't know the exact numbers, between 2,000 and 3,000 soldiers. That was a huge blow to Israel. And after that defeat, they didn't suffer a defeat, but it suffered a real blow. Yes, then it reconsidered before 73, the famous line by Israeli defense minister and then foreign minister Moshe Dayan was, we prefer Sharm el-Sheikh without peace to peace without Sharm el-Sheikh. Namely, we're not withdrawing from the Sinai, we'd rather have Sharm el-Sheikh without peace. After the 73 war, 2,000 to 3,000 casualties, they rethink, we're going to leave. We can't afford this anymore. And the second time they withdrew was from Lebanon. But in Lebanon, it took a very long, protracted guerrilla war, lasting approximately 20 years, with a very sophisticated guerrilla army, which had open borders with allies, which was able to supply it with quite sophisticated weaponry, and they imposed many hundreds of casualties on Israel before it finally decided in 2000, May 2000, to withdraw. There's no possibility. I'm not speaking right or wrong, moral or immoral. I'm just speaking.
The Palestinians this time
there's
managed
no.
to close Benghazi
We're
airport.
talking about 64 casualties. We have to be realistic about these things. Yes, it was more than Israel has experienced. Yes, it's true that the Palestinians made a better showing on the battlefield. But is it
But
realistic?
there is a cumulative pattern here, which is, I mean, in every conflict, it is the might of the Palestinians is growing.
Nizar, it may be cumulative, but we're a long, long way from
Remember
quantity.
that in
We're a long,
1996
long way from quantity turning into quality.
Yes.
We can go from 10 casualties in Operation Cast Lead to 64 casualties, Israeli casualties, in Operation Protective Edge. But we're a long way. You have to, Nizar.
Remember that in
Nizar,
1996, sorry to interrupt.
Nizar, I know you. You're a very smart guy, and you follow politics with a hawk's eye. I know you. You have to look at the balance sheet at the end. Yes, it was 64 casualties. No doubt, we don't disagree. Did it extract any political gain? Political in terms of the goals that were set. Did it extract any gain in terms of the goals that were set? The original agreement, ceasefire ultimatum proposed by Sisi, the Egyptian so-called president, called for a ceasefire without lifting the blockade. Hamas rejected it because it wants the blockade lifted. We are now 2,200 dead Palestinians later, Gaza reduced to rubble, pulverized. Right. Now, I am not diminishing the resistance, the indomitable will of the people of Gaza. I'm simply saying let's be objective and sober. Let's not get carried away with rhetorical flights of fancy. Did they achieve any of the political goals that they set for themselves?
There were two arguments on the Palestinian arena. One of them was we have to pursue armed resistance. The other one was to pursue negotiations as presented by...
I don't agree with either of them.
And now, who do you believe, after what happened, is the stronger argument among the Palestinians?
Nizar, we're not on the same page on this particular issue. I am perfectly cognizant, painfully so, that negotiations, diplomacy, on its own will achieve nothing. That's why I dismissed your comment earlier about Hanan Ashrawi going to the United Nations. The UN is, the UN, as it used to be said of parliaments in general, is a talking shop. Nothing is going to happen there. So we can set that aside, no disagreement. I think if we honestly reckon what happened in Gaza, not in terms of feel-goods and not looking strictly in military balance sheets, but looking at what ought to be the final purpose. What was achieved in terms of improving the lives of the people of Gaza?
It's a long battle.
So,
and how can we isolate Gaza
because,
from North
from
South Lebanon, from Syria, from Iran,
Nazar,
can we isolate them?
This occupation of Gaza has now been going on for 60 or more years. The people since 2007 have had to endure an inhuman, merciless, leaving aside illegal, blockade. Are we going to talk about consigning their fate for another 20 years to that blockade, or 30 or 40? Or are we going to do what a sensible person does? A sensible person, when you try once, it fails. Try twice, it fails. Try 3 times. Yes, they do, in my opinion.
Which are?
Okay. The problem with talking about my alternative is, I'll get to it in a half second, there is this military ethos in the Arab Muslim world, such that unless it's guns, rockets, missiles, it's not real resistance. So let me just give you a hypothetical. Speculate. First of all, before I give you the speculative possibility, we have to learn from history. We can't just recite endlessly slogans. How did Protective Edge, Israel's operation, end? Israel is decimating Gaza. Yes, it's true. It held back, even when it entered in the ground invasion, it held back to the border area because of the problem of the tunnels and the casualties. But beyond the border, it was targeting everything in sight, destroyed approximately 160 mosques, 360 factories. It was a horror story. So what happens? Israel targets one UN school shelter. Israel targets a second UN school shelter. Israel targets a third, a fourth, a fifth. At this point, the pressure inside the UN is beginning to reach boiling point. It's Ban Ki-moon, where are you? You comatose US puppet. Where are you? They are targeting UN facilities, UN institutions. Finally, the pressure on Ban Ki-moon becomes unbearable.
Which is financed by US as well,
right.
Europe.
Finally, the pressure on Ban Ki-moon becomes unbearable, and the comatose UN puppet wakes up, and he calls what Israel is doing criminal. Now, after he used the C word, criminal, President Obama is isolated on the world stage. Up until that point, for 4 weeks, all he kept saying each day, he or his spokespersons, was, Israel has the right to defend itself. Now Ban Ki-moon is saying Israel's defense is criminal. So now the pressure comes on Obama. You got to say something because you're looking ridiculous. You're looking absurd on the world's stage. So finally the State Department says the same day, August 3rd, that Israel's acts are disgraceful and appalling. What happens next? Same day, August 3rd, Ban Ki-moon, Barack Obama, the same day, Prime Minister Netanyahu announces ground invasion is over. We're withdrawing. So you look at that.
Do you think they took that decision only because Ban Ki-moon and Obama?
Not because of Ban Ki-moon, because of Obama.
Or because their casualty number.
No.
That day,
because remember
that day they lost an officer and they lost more soldiers.
On that day they lost 2 civilians because of the no. Okay, I'm not sure. I can't remember. It may be, but no, that wasn't the reason. Because they had already confined the ground invasion to the border, so the likelihood of significant new casualties was quite small. It was just a free-for-all. It was just destroying everything in sight.
But Obama did not ask them to pull out.
I don't like to engage in undocumented speculation, but I have a pretty good feeling they called up Israel and said, we can't support it anymore. It's becoming politically untenable. When Ban Ki-moon speaks out, you're making us look ridiculous. We're the only ones in the world defending it at this point. We can't do that.
Do you think Ban Ki-moon said that without consultations with Joe?
Yes, I think the pressure became unbearable, as you pointed out in our private conversation. Once the head of UNRWA in Jerusalem, Chris Gunness, was all over it went viral on the internet when he broke down sobbing over what was happening. Yes, I think Ban Ki-moon did not consult the U.S. He knew he had to say something or he was in a lot of trouble. The internal pressure can become unbearable. You're the general secretary. Everybody's calling you. Why aren't you saying anything? Did you see that video? Why aren't you doing anything? He has to act. There's a limit. There's even a limit to how much a puppet can be a puppet, So, yes. So, wait. Before we get off track, I said, now that's the history. So what can we learn from it? In my opinion, based on that experience, that those 3 events in that single day, let's hypothetically imagine, you have 1.7 million people in Gaza. Let's say those 1.7 million people are organized, mobilized, just as Hamas used incredible ingenuity, cleverness, investment of energy in creating that tunnel system, which was really a wonder of civil engineering.
So it was a surprise.
Yeah, it was incredible. I mean, with the tools they had, what they were able to construct. It's not as if they had earth movers. It's very impressive. But let's say they used that same ingenuity, cleverness, investment of time and energy in organizing and mobilizing Gaza's most precious resource, the indomitable will of the people, and then organized a march. 1.7 million people. We put at the front of those 1.7 million people the million children in Gaza, because it's the blockade is killing them. We have to be clear about that. 95% of the drinking water in Gaza is unfit for human consumption. Yes. Unfit. You're killing the kids.
Of course.
You're killing the kids.
So this is the argument.
So you put
to die
slowly, one second. Yeah, fine, but wait. You put the 1 million kids at the head of the demonstration. They hold up the banners. End the strangulation of Gaza. End the illegal blockade. We make it clear. The blockade is killing us. It's illegal. They march to Eretz checkpoint, the border crossing with Israel. They want to go through. Yes, you're going to tell me Israel's, I don't know, Israel will kill them, some of them? Yes. Will it kill a lot of, kill a lot of them?
When they try to cross.
March to Eretz checkpoint, the border crossing with Israel. They want to go through. Yes, you're going to tell me Israel's, I don't know, Israel will kill them, some of them? Yes. Will it kill a lot of, kill a lot of them?
When they try to cross the border in Lebanon and in
yeah,
Syria.
but okay, I'll get to that. I'll get to that. I'm ready for the objections, but let me just lay out the scenario. They march. Several, as I said, 1.7 million. They have the banners. they make clear their goal. We want to end the illegal, merciless blockade of Gaza. They march on Eretz checkpoint. And then we in the West, because just like the people of Gaza are the most precious resource of the Palestinian struggle, the Palestinians have another resource which they've never used. Very foolishly, in my opinion. They have the resource of the vast reservoir of support for Palestine all around the world. There is no other cause that remotely compares, that remotely compares in terms of popular support around the world to Palestine. Tibet? No. Kashmir? No. Even in the United States, climate change? No. Withdraw from Iraq? No. There is nothing compared to support for Palestine. So imagine if, as they march on Eretz checkpoint, hundreds of thousands of Palestine supporters, which is very real. It's not a number I'm conjuring in my head. Remember, just in London, during Operation Cast Lead, just in London, the demonstration was 150,000 people. Now imagine if the crowds, these people, their supporters, converged on the UN in New York and the UN in Geneva, surrounded both institutions and shut them down, and said, we're not going to allow you to pass until the blockade is lifted. You have to remember, because you work at the...
We don't know how many people are determined to that.
You would be very surprised. You would be very surprised. I one day got so frustrated, I just went on the internet and I said, let's go and have a sit-in. No organizing, no nothing. Nothing.
But you are a leader in the Middle East.
No, I'm not a leader. Because as I said, Nizar, I'm fully aware of what I'm good at and what I'm not good at. I'm not an organizer. Politics is organizing. And I said, you have to invest the same amount of energy, creativity, ingenuity, and time in organizing the people of Gaza as you invested in your tunnels. I'm not that. I'm just saying, I just did it in the spur of the moment. I was watching something on the internet, it just appalled me. I decide, what the hell, I'm going to get arrested tomorrow. Within 12 hours, 150 people came to the Israeli mission to the UN, and 26 of us got arrested. You would be very surprised at how determined many people are to achieve justice for the people of Palestine.
But without the steadfastness of the Gazans, probably this enthusiasm wouldn't have
absolutely
taken place.
Correct. The question is to what end do you use the steadfastness? I say mass nonviolent civil resistance, combine it there with here, you can achieve the same goal with much less death and destruction as you haven't achieved with armed struggle.
Well, like Gandhi, sacrifices give results, like what happened to Ban Ki-moon. Without these sacrifices, probably he wouldn't have condemned.
That's correct.
Obama wouldn't have asked for stop. So, what do you think what happened in Gaza will have an impact? What impact it will have on the?
Let's just stop the camera. I just have to run to the bathroom. This is what happens when you have too much tea.
Let me talk again. Okay, we go for a break and we'll be back soon. We are back with Professor Norman Finkelstein talking about Gaza. Mr. Finkelstein, you spoke about the impact on internationally, the enthusiasm Gaza has created. How about its impact on the Arab neighboring countries and the people of the region who've been embroiled for a long time, now more than 3 years in internal wars and other things, and Palestine has gone off their radar?
Well, it's a real problem, and we have to acknowledge it. We can't create fictions, self-satisfying or self-gratifying fictions. The fact of the matter is that the people of Palestine are more isolated than ever. This past 50 days, the protective edge...
Not only that, Hamas was embroiled as well in Syrian conflict. They took part with they took sides inside Syria, And that probably have isolated them even from their close ally.
Whichever way you cut it, whatever decision Hamas would have made, it would have ended up still isolated in the Arab Muslim world. They had very few options this time around, and the fact of the matter is there are humanitarian, not just political, but there are humanitarian crises now in Iraq, in Syria, and throughout large swaths of the Arab Muslim world. And so the likelihood that there would be mass rallying behind the people of Gaza this time was pretty remote.
But the Palestinians, talking to the Palestinians, they say now, we've noticed that many of the Arab states were on the side of Israel.
Yes, this time
only few states were with the Palestinians and few groups.
Right.
Would that make a reshuffling of alliances in the region?
Look, they don't have that much support now in the Arab Muslim world for two reasons. There are now open schisms within the Arab Muslim world. Look what happened. The Arab League supported the Egyptian, the Tony Blair Sisi original ceasefire, which basically...
Did you expect otherwise?
Well, the Arab League very rarely just openly betrays the Palestinians, maybe behind the scenes, but this was an open betrayal of the Palestinians. And it was clear that Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Egypt were openly hoping for Hamas to be pulverized
the same thing
by
like
Israel.
2006 with Hezbollah.
Yes, but there's a difference in the power between the two forces. But the thing is, again, we have to be sober, we have to be realistic. The problem is, in my opinion, and I'm going to be blunt about these things, because I'm reaching a level of frustration that perhaps comes with age and the fact that I've been involved in this since, 32 years now. I started in 1982, and it's very painful not to see only no progress, but to see regress, things getting worse and worse. The Palestinians, leaving aside all the other stuff, which is just, it's revolting, the kind of sandbox, grade school, exchanges that you read about on the internet between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. It's just contemptible. These are adults carrying on like children. You said this, I said that. You did this, I said that.
You're talking about Khalid Mish'al's argument with Mr. Mahmoud Abbas.
The transcript of which was, this is. I don't want to be too old-fashioned, but it's very hard for me to imagine Vladimir Ilyich Lenin and Leon Trotsky having exchanges like this, But wait. The problem with the Palestinians, one of the problems, there are many, one of the problems is they don't take advantage of their assets. As I said, one big asset they have is the indomitable will of the people of Gaza. A second big asset they have is the huge solidarity movement, which no other cause in the world even remotely compares to. A third...
Some talk about the legal argument and the legal arena.
Yeah, I'll get to that in a half moment. But there's a third asset which emerged during the last hostilities. The third asset, which is quite remarkable for those who are looking with their eyes and thinking, was the emergence of the Latin American bloc solidly behind the Palestinians. That was very courageous.
Of course.
That was remarkably principled. They had nothing to gain from it. And yet, except for Paraguay, all the South American and some Central American countries like El Salvador came out in support of the Palestinians. Why not work with that asset? There are all these resolutions now being talked about in the UN, about setting up an EU force on the Rafah border and so on and so forth to monitor whether weapons go in. Why not work with that Latin American bloc and have them put forth a resolution that's supporting the Palestinians? Why are you only working with the Americans?
You are assuming that Arab states are independent.
I'm talking about the Palestinians. Why is the Palestinian leadership, where does it go? It either goes to Qatar or Turkey or the EU or the US. But here you have a Latin American bloc which showed courage, which showed backbone, which showed principle. And you don't do anything with it.
Some would say they need salaries at the end of the month.
Who?
The civil servants in Gaza,
Yeah, but you have a chance to put forth an alternative resolution. I mean, UN resolution. Let them work with them. Take advantage of that asset. They don't take advantage of anything. Hamas, all it does is talks about armed struggle. Armed struggle. Palestinian Authority, all it talks about is begging the US and begging the EU for something. And all the assets they have, the people, the Solidarity Movement, now the Latin American bloc, it's all squandered. They deserve what they got. Not the people, but the leadership. They never extract any political gains, notwithstanding the fact, notwithstanding the fact that for all the self-pity that they carry on with, oh, we're so isolated, nobody cares about us. That's just nonsense.
Okay, how about
they
the
have a
regional powers? How about the
they have a
regional-
much better cards to play with than most struggles in the world, because most struggles in the world neither you nor I have even heard of.
That's
They
true.
just go on mass killings and nobody even knows about them.
Some would say that Latin American countries are far away and they cannot really.
They're not
be
far away.
logistically
That's
far-
not. You'd
But
be
how-
very surprised. Wait,
but
Nizar,
how- yeah, how-
Nizar.
How about the
Do you
regional-
know?
the
Do you
regional
know?
countries?
Do you know who was originally responsible for UN Resolution 242? Are you aware? It's an interesting history. There were two blocs. There was the Latin American bloc and what was called the Afro-Asian bloc, the non-aligned bloc. And they were the ones originally in the General Assembly who put forth the terms that became later in the Security Council, UN Resolution 242. It was, I've documented it, and if at some point you'd like to read it, I'll show you. It was the Latin American bloc. You say they're far away, but you know what? Little countries like Ecuador are now capable
But they
of
abandoned
asserting
Syria,
themselves.
for example.
Remember, little Ecuador far away showed the courage to give asylum to Julian Assange.
Yes,
They have courage.
of course.
Do something with it. Do something with it. When the whole world turned Assange into a pariah, Ecuador showed the courage.
That's on the political level, but even regionally, when they went and get involved into the Syrian crisis, they abandoned their backbone backer in the region, as well as with Iran. They took some of
Look,
them.
I'm not going to go into the Syrian crisis because one way or another,
Also Hezbollah. I mean, they severed relationship with Hezbollah for some time. That's something regionally, which influences directly what happened in Gaza as well. Where did the weapons come from?
I'm not going to. Which weapons?
For example, the Cornets, the Hornets, or these weapons which were used, anti-tank ones. They
had a few weapons.
They used them. They did not have them in the previous.
They're not going to
conflict.
have. They're not going to have them again. I mean, I just think this is fantasy. They're not going to have them
Well,
again.
they were very
The border,
effective against
the
tanks.
Egyptian border is going to be sealed. Yes, there'll be some corruption, and they'll be able to smuggle in some things. But
It was sealed before.
No, I mean if you look
Well,
at
Sisi, when he came to
Right,
power,
there were-
he
there-
blocked it totally.
that's
Also,
correct.
Morsi blocked it.
I don't want to get into details. Morsi was not great. He was not terrible. It wasn't completely sealed off until Sisi came to power. But it's silly to quibble about these things. The important
Do you
thing.
think the Israelis can really seal their border now from the tunnel side?
My opinion. Can they seal themselves from the border, from the
Yeah,
tunnels?
I mean,
Of
can
course.
They seal
Listen. You very correctly said the tunnels were built with their hands. It's true. They were using shovels, and they apparently developed some sort of mechanism with a bicycle. I don't know exactly how it worked. in order to dig the tunnels without making noise, because they knew if they made the noise, it would be
Yeah, it will be
a signal detected. But let's be for real. If they could build those tunnels with the most primitive earth-moving equipment, you don't think that Israel can bring in some very deep-going bulldozers and build a wall that's much deeper than the tunnels and just pour in cement?
Some stories that been running around is that yes, Morsi or Sisi put steel to block the tunnels, but there are other stories that said that this steel was recycled by the Palestinians, used in different ways.
Maybe.
They went underneath it.
I'm not going to argue these things. I want to be realistic and sober because I don't want to play an armchair general. I want to see some justice, old-fashioned word, some justice to be achieved by the people of Palestine. When I look at the historical record, in order to budge Israel and to leave the Sinai, it required the full might of the Egyptian army on one front, combined with, not as significantly, the Syrian army on the other front in 1973. That's what it required to get Israel to give up the Sinai. In order to get Israel to withdraw from Lebanon in May 2006, it required a 20-year-long guerrilla war by a formidable guerrilla army that was armed freely by Iran and Syria through a porous border. There is nothing remotely comparable among the people of Gaza.
There are two things
We should stop weaving fantasies. And as I said, when a strategy continues to fail, the sensible thing is to rethink and try alternatives. Now, you could say to me, no alternatives are available. I don't agree with that. There is an option that can work, I think. I can't prove it.
Now, let's talk here about what is in play in the next, for Israel, after what happened in Gaza. What is the next adventure they can go through? They've been annexing, taking more, grabbing land, but do you think that they are there for another war in the near future?
No. Israel is perfectly aware. First of all, we have to remember, I'm not defending Netanyahu, he's a monster. We agree on that. He did not want originally to go into Gaza. He thought that he would bang up Hamas, get Hamas to do something crazy, and then he can go say, you see, I told you so. Hamas is a terrorist organization, and we can't recognize this unity government or coalition government that they formed in April 2014. But things started escalating out of control. He found himself in a situation which he actually didn't want. Not to say he's a good guy, he just didn't want it, because he did pretty awful during Operation Pillar of Defense in November 2012. He didn't want a repeat of that. But things started to escalate, and then,
Well, he escalated them.
He escalated them,
You
but
cannot say that the three Israelis
No, I said he wanted to evoke some crazy act by Hamas so he could say to the EU and the US to break off relations with the newly formed unity government because Hamas is terrorist. That's what he wanted. But then when he started to try to provoke them, the projectiles started to come. And then he couldn't stop the projectiles coming because Hamas had its own strategy. It was going.
Isn't that strange that they started from the beginning? Once Israel went into attack, the Palestinians retaliated by hitting very far, like Tel Aviv.
Because I think they adopted and adapted the Hezbollah strategy, that they were going to.
Hezbollah did not start from Tel Aviv.
No, but they thought that they would lure Israel into Gaza, and they figured, not entirely incorrectly, that their newly created tunnel system would then cause, relatively significant Israeli casualties. Israel didn't expect that. It was quite surprised by the resistance and the effectiveness of Hamas. So Netanyahu didn't originally want it. But the bottom line is the Palestinians don't have remotely the capacity that Hezbollah or the Egyptian army could have inflicted. So why are we weaving
You are
these
putting
fantasies?
Hezbollah and the Egyptian army on a par here.
No, I'm saying that well, it was a very different kind of conflict. In 1973, it was a conventional war against conventional armies. In the case of Lebanon, it was a guerrilla war, which was like, not unlike, for example, in Vietnam, where the North Vietnamese were supplied with quite very sophisticated weapons. Not the most sophisticated. For example, at the time, there was the issue of whether to supply North Vietnam with the most sophisticated anti-aircraft weapons. I think it was called, I could be wrong, the SAM-3. And the Soviet Union didn't want to supply them because they thought that would escalate the level of conflict. But they were being supplied by China and Russia with quite sophisticated weapons. And they had on the other side the guerrilla war being waged in the south by the Vietnamese, the Viet Minh. In the case of Hezbollah, you had the same guerrilla force, but it was also being supplied by formidable regional neighbors with sophisticated weapons. And it took, we have to remember, it took 20 years and a significant number. What was the last, I think the final number was what, how many? I think around 600 Israeli soldiers were killed. We're not in that league with Gaza. It's a fantasy. And it does trouble me, with all due respect for Syed Nasrallah, it does trouble me that he's counseling the Palestinians to pursue a strategy which has no prospect whatsoever of success.
If it is left alone.
Excuse me?
If it is left alone, it has no prospect. But if there was it was concerted, say with Hezbollah.
It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen, you know.
Okay.
You're giving me these speculations of the order, if grandma had wheels, she'd be a baby carriage. Too many ifs.
How do you view Hezbollah's situation now, or capabilities, after what happened in Gaza and after what happened in Syria? Are they embattled? Are they stronger? Did they acquire new lessons out of Gaza and Syria at the same time?
I'm not in a position to answer that. I've not followed Hezbollah closely enough. I don't like to speak on topics where I don't feel I have a qualification.
Okay, let's talk about self-defense. You put a very good argument in your recent writings that the right of self-defense is there, and it's emanating from the right of the superpowers, basically, who speak about their right to use nuclear weapons in order to deter any survivability matter. Or if they are attacked and they find that their survival is at stake, they can use even nuclear weapons to obliterate their opponents.
Yes.
If we apply that argument, as you say, in the Middle East, how does it work?
Well, the international law says that you're not allowed to use indiscriminate weapons, weapons which target not just military objectives, but also civilians and civilian infrastructure. It's illegal. So in 1996, the case became before the International Court of Justice whether it's legal to use nuclear weapons, because obviously they can't distinguish between civilians and military objectives, given the amount of devastation they inflict in one single blow. It was a very interesting case before the International Court of Justice, very interesting submissions. I've read it. Actually, I'm going to be teaching it this coming semester in Turkey, that particular case. And what the International Court of Justice ruled, it said that we cannot say for certain whether under international law it's illegal for a country or a state whose survival is at stake, we cannot say definitely that they can't use nuclear weapons. So my argument, my response to that is, if a state might be allowed to use these mass weapons of destruction or weapons of mass destruction like nuclear weapons, if a state might be allowed to use a weapon of mass destruction like a nuclear weapon when its survival is at stake, then surely a people has the right to use projectiles against an enemy when its survival is at stake, which is what the Palestinians in Gaza were doing.
Suicide bombers.
Look, I don't want
What's
to.
the difference between a nuclear power?
Listen,
Well, the Japanese use them. The Vietnamese use them.
Listen, international law, in large part, is completely insane and makes distinctions which, if you're sitting in Mars, you would think this planet is, by any reckoning, completely lunatic. So as one of the judges put it in the International Court of Justice case on the nuclear weapons, the 1996 case, he said there's something slightly insane going on here. He said in 1899, the international community, it ruled that the dum-dum bullet, causes unnecessary or excessive pain, and therefore we're declaring the dum-dum bullet illegal. And he says, but we can't reach the conclusion in this court that a nuclear weapon which will vaporize 100,000 people in the blink of an eye, we can't reach the conclusion that a nuclear weapon is illegal. That's completely insane.
Exactly.
As a friend of mine said, there's all this talk about the horror of ISIS because it beheads people. Okay, I'm not going to defend ISIS. There are better causes in the world to defend than ISIS. Syed Nasrallah said they're a monster, and I'm willing to use his language. Yes, ISIS is a monster. I think it's a Western-created monster, but that's a separate issue. But there is, my friend said, do you know what bombs which drop from the sky, what they do to people? You think that beheading is so barbaric? Have you ever seen what a bomb does to a person? Yeah. So the law is crazy. The whole moral scale, the whole moral hierarchy is crazy.